The Aztecs were more than just warriors. They were masters of fear, wielding it with a precision and purpose that made them one of the most intimidating forces in Mesoamerica. Imagine a society that saw every battle as a sacred ritual, where every captured enemy wasn't just a prisoner, but an offering to the gods. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, wasn't just a city, it was a kingdom of symbols and shadows, with towering temples and rows of skull racks as stark reminders of their power and devotion. But it wasn't just their brutal rituals or fearsome weapons that struck terror. It was the sheer, unshakable belief that they were the chosen ones, destined to rule and keep the gods' hunger at bay. Aztec warriors didn't just fight, they hunted, captured enemies not to kill but to keep alive for their gods' favor. And as they grew, their influence stretched across Mesoamerica, fueled by blood, faith, and the knowledge that they were unstoppable. So what was it that made the Aztecs so terrifying? Well, that's what we're here to find out. The Aztecs weren't your typical ancient civilization. They were ambitious, resilient, and quite honestly driven by beliefs and customs that might seem extreme by today's standards. They were latecomers to the Valley of Mexico, a place already filled with powerful established groups. You had the Tonics, the Aola, and others vying for land and resources. So for the Aztecs, making their mark wasn't going to be easy. In fact, they'd started out as underdogs, arriving around the early 1300s with little more than their god's guidance and a few scattered supplies. The story of their rise is nothing short of remarkable. The Aztecs were believed to have come from a mythical land called on a place thought to be located somewhere north of the Valley of Mexico in Ondade, being one of several Nahad-speaking tribes. But they eventually set out on a journey south, driven by prophecy and ambition. This prophecy told them that they'd reach their promised land when they saw an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth, a scene that still resonates today on the Mexican flag. When they finally stumbled upon this divine sight in the middle of Lake Tixcoco, it wasn't exactly a prime piece of real estate. It was a swampy, marshy island that no one else wanted. But the Aztecs were scrappy and saw potential in the most unlikely places. They set to work, creating Tenochtitlan, their island capital, which would eventually grow into one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Building on a lake came with unique challenges, but the Aztecs didn't hesitate. They learned to construct chinampas, man-made floating gardens that provided fertile ground for crops right on the water. Chinampas allowed them to farm efficiently, making the Aztecs largely self-sufficient and feeding a population that would swell into the hundreds of thousands. Tenochtitlan wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, with temples, causeways, and aqueducts that channeled fresh water across the city. As it grew, it became a center for trade, art, and culture, drawing merchants, artisans, and leaders from all over Mesoamerica. But here's the thing, the Aztecs weren't just interested in building a city, they had their sights set on something bigger, a true empire. To make that happen, they needed allies and resources. They soon joined forces with two nearby city-states, Tixcoco and Tacon, forming what's known as the Triple Alliance. Together they launched a campaign of expansion, subduing or intimidating neighboring regions, and bringing in a steady stream of tribute, everything from cacao to jaguar skins to precious metals. This tribute was the lifeblood of their empire, supporting the Aztec elites and funding their massive ceremonial and military undertakings. Life in Tenochtitlan and within the Aztec world was centered around duty to the gods, the family, and society. Each Aztec citizen had a role to play, while some rose to become warriors, priests, artisans, or traders. Many others contributed through farming, construction, or domestic duties. Education was also a big deal. Boys and girls attended school, where they learned everything from religion to military skills, preparing for their future roles in Aztec society, with their religion influencing everything from daily life to warfare, and their economy thriving on both trade and tribute. The Aztecs steadily built their power. By the time the 1400s rolled around, they'd become the dominant force in Mesoamerica, and Tenochtitlan was the beating heart of it all, a city that inspired awe and fear among both allies and enemies. Religion for the Aztecs wasn't just a Sunday affair, it was the backbone of their entire world. They believed that the gods controlled everything, the hard harvests, the rain, the cycles of the sun, and even life itself. To keep these gods happy, sacrifices were essential, but not just any sacrifices. We're talking human sacrifices, performed regularly and often in full view of the public. The Aztecs believed that the universe was in a delicate balance constantly at risk of collapsing if the gods weren't kept satisfied. This wasn't just a distant fear for them, it was immediate, something that could happen any day. Their gods had created the world through a series of cosmic battles, and the Aztecs saw it as their duty to sustain that creation through blood offerings. Their main deity, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, had to battle the forces of darkness each night to rise again in the morning. If he lost, it would mean the end of everything, so keeping Huitzilopochtli strong was the priority. To fuel these cosmic battles, the gods required energy, and in the Aztec worldview that energy was found in human blood. Sacrifices weren't random or done just for shock value. They were meticulously planned events that carried immense religious significance. The Aztec calendar was full of ceremonial days dedicated to different gods, each requiring specific offerings, and the gods weren't picky. They demanded warriors, captives, slaves, and sometimes even the Aztec people themselves. One of the biggest ceremonies was the Feast of Tenochtitlan, dedicated to Tenochtitlan, the god of the night sky and ancestral memory. Each year, a young man would be chosen to embody Tenochtitlan for a full year, living in luxury and treated with reverence, as if he were the god himself. But at the end of his year, he'd climb the temple steps in full view of the city and give his life as an offering. The Aztecs believed that these sacrifices would strengthen the gods and keep the world turning. Then there were sacrifices made in honor of Huitzilopochtli during the festival of Pankisi. Warriors captured in battle were ideal for these ceremonies, as their blood was thought to be particularly potent and valuable. Aztec priests would lead the sacrificial rituals, which took place on top of towering temples, so everyone in the city could witness the act. After being prepared and blessed, the captive would be laid across a stone slab, and the priest, using an obsidian blade, would cut open the chest and remove the heart. It was raised to the sky, still beating, as an offering, and the blood would be poured over the temple stones. The Aztecs also had a unique view of death and the afterlife. They believed in multiple destinations for the soul, depending on how one died. Warriors who fell in battle or people who died as sacrifices were believed to accompany the sun on its journey. This wasn't seen as tragic, it was an honorable end, and it gave purpose to the idea of capturing warriors instead of just killing them. These captives weren't simply prisoners of war, they were future offerings destined to fulfill the sacred cycle of life and death for the Aztecs. These sacrifices were non-negotiable. They truly believed the gods depended on them to survive. To them, these rituals weren't acts of cruelty or savagery, but a necessary duty, and the chilling part, they took pride in it. To be sacrificed was considered an honor, and for warriors, it was the ultimate end, granting them a kind of immortality in the Aztec afterlife. It's no wonder these rituals sent a ripple of fear throughout Mesoamerica. Imagine being a neighbor to the Aztecs, knowing they saw human life as currency to bargain with the gods. The prospect of being captured by the Aztecs wasn't just frightening because of the pain or death itself, it was the sheer intensity of their beliefs and the inevitability of that sacrificial altar. The Aztecs took warfare seriously. It was a ritual, a duty, and a way of life. They didn't see war as a simple clash of arms. For them it was a sacred act. Their aim wasn't just to win territory or defeat an enemy. As we just mentioned, their goal was often to capture, not kill, so they could feed the unquenchable thirst of their gods. In the Aztec mindset, warriors were hunters, not killers, and that prey was other humans. Aztec boys were trained from a young age to become warriors. For them, military service was an expectation, not an option, and each young man aspired to become a warrior worthy of the gods. As they grew older, they'd attend to Tel Poli, a kind of military school if they were commoners, or a Calac if they were of noble birth, where they would learn about weapons, tactics, and the art of capturing enemies. To an Aztec warrior, capturing an enemy alive was considered a greater achievement than simply killing them in battle. Each captive brought them honor, prestige, and spiritual favor, and they didn't stop at training. Aztec warriors knew how to use their resources to maximum advantage. Their weapons weren't elaborate, but they were devastating. Fuel and Atlel, for example, were two of their most deadly weapons, but we'll get into those later. Aztec warfare was about much more than just weapons and tactics. They had a complex hierarchy and an intense system of ranks and rewards. The greatest among them would become eagle warriors, or jaguar warriors, the elite ranks that commanded respect and fear throughout the empire. These warriors wore elaborate costumes made from animal pelts, feathers, and bones, transforming themselves into symbols of power, embodying the spirit of the fierce animals they represented. The idea of the flower wars, or Zia Yoto, was another aspect that set the Aztecs apart. These were planned battles between the Aztecs and their neighboring states, not necessarily for conquest, but to capture warriors for sacrifice. Both sides entered these battles with a sort of grim understanding. They weren't fighting to eliminate one another, but to gather captives. The flower wars were a terrifying concept for those involved, because it blurred the lines between conflict and ritual. For the Aztecs, it was a way to maintain a steady flow of sacrificial victims without the risk of full-scale war, and it also served as a testing ground where young Aztec warriors could prove themselves in battle. When they conquered a region, the Aztecs didn't just leave a wake of destruction. Instead, they demanded tribute from the conquered people, goods, crops, precious metals, and even people to be offered as sacrificial captives. This tribute system allowed the Aztecs to expand their empire with minimal bloodshed, since most regions quickly learned it was better to pay up than to face the full wrath of Tenochtitlan and those who resisted, while the Aztecs would make an example out of them, leaving behind horror stories for the survivors to tell through a combination of superior tactics, effective weaponry, relentless training, and strategic psychology. The Aztecs didn't just fight wars, they practically reinvented warfare for their time and place. Every clash was a test of courage, strength, and above all faith. For the Aztecs, each victory was a sign that the gods were pleased, while every captive was one step closer to keeping the sun rising for another day. Hey everyone, just a quick intermission here. I wanted to say thank you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. They do know that over 80% of you who are watching aren't subscribed to the channel. If you've enjoyed this content so far, it would be incredible if you could hit that subscribe button. It's a small jest, but it really helps the channel grow and ensures that you won't miss any more of our fascinating stories we explored together. Also, if you're feeling generous, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment, and share with anyone else who may enjoy it. Your support really does make a difference and keeps content coming. Thanks again, and let's get back to the story. However long before Aztec warriors closed in on an enemy, they'd already started breaking them down. Mentally, the Aztecs understood something powerful: that fear can paralyze a person, unravel an army, and destroy resistance from the inside out. So they made psychological warfare and art striking fear into the hearts of their enemies before the first blow ever landed. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a neighboring tribe, hearing the news that the Aztecs were coming. You'd know they weren't coming to simply raid your village or defeat you in battle. They were coming to capture you. Word spread quickly in Mesoamerica about the fate of those who opposed the Aztecs. Tribes that had once stood up to them were now paying tribute or facing annihilation. The stories of warriors dragged up the steps of the temple, made to have their hearts torn out, traveled far and wide, leaving a ripple of dread through every town and village in their path. The Aztecs knew how to amplify this fear as they prepared for battle. They didn't march in quietly. They came in loud, dressed to terrify and armed with symbols of death. Each warrior wore costumes meant to unsettle their opponents. Some donned full animal pelts looking like jaguars or eagles, while others wore grotesque masks with skull design or features that made them look more beast than man. Their attire wasn't just for show, it was designed to make the enemy think they were facing not just soldiers but supernatural forces. Then there were the sounds of war before even setting foot on the battlefield. Aztec warriors would let loose a cacophony of sound meant to unnerve anyone within earshot. They'd beat on massive drums, creating deep pulsing rhythms that could be heard from miles away, like the heartbeat of something massive and deadly, drawing nearer alongside the drums. Warriors would blow on death whistles, instruments that sounded eerily like human screams. Hearing hundreds of these whistles shrieking in the distance was enough to make even the toughest fighters second-guess their courage. Here's an example of what the death whistle sounded like. The Aztec didn't stop there. They used their knowledge of terrain and ambush tactics to set up attacks that kept their enemies guessing. Aztec warriors would set traps, wait until the right moment to strike, and close in quickly, overwhelming their opponents before they even had a chance to react. This hit-and-run tactic kept their enemies off balance and added to the overall feeling of dread. You never quite knew when or where the Aztecs would strike. For those unlucky enough to survive a confrontation, the real horror awaited back in Aztec territory. Captives would be paraded through the streets of Tenochtitlan, a psychological blow that reminded everyone that the gods demanded sacrifice. The captives were sometimes forced to witness the sacrificial rituals of other captives before it was their turn, driving home the inevitability of their fate. The Aztecs also manipulated the fear of the unknown. They understood the power of mystery and uncertainty. Aztec warriors rarely engaged in direct, drawn-out battles, unless necessary. Instead, they'd harass, stalk, and pick off their enemies one by one, leaving them in a state of constant anxiety. The knowledge that you were being hunted, but didn't know when the next strike would come, was enough to make some armies crumble before the main battle had even started. What's more, they didn't just use fear for the enemy. Aztec leaders would instill a sense of pride and duty in their own people, who believed that every victory was the will of the god. Odious citizens in Tenochtitlan felt they were protected by the favor of Whitlocky, and warriors were honored for their bravery and skill in capturing prisoners. This mix of religious appeal and a carefully cultivated image of invincibility meant that every enemy had reason to fear an encounter with the Aztecs. Ultimately, psychological warfare was as important to the Aztec strategy as any weapon by the time the enemy stood face to face. Faced with Aztec warriors, many were already broken, defeated in spirit if not yet in body. The Aztecs didn't mess around when it came to their weapons. They weren't armed with the swords and guns that European armies would later bring to their shores, but that didn't make their weapons any less terrifying. The Aztecs took the materials they had, woodstone and obsidian, and turned them into tools of destruction that were as brutal as they were effective. Each weapon had a purpose, and in the hands of skilled Aztec warriors they were deadly. Their most famous weapon, without a doubt, was the makua. Weedle picture a wooden club flat and about the length of a sword with sharp obsidian blades embedded along its edges. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, might not sound impressive, but it's deceptively dangerous. It can be sharpened to a finer edge than even steel. Those obsidian blades were so sharp that Spanish conquistadors later reported seeing a maku while decapit at a horse in a single swing. This wasn't a weapon that just wounded, it could maim or kill in one brutal strike, and since Aztec warriors aimed to capture their enemies alive, the makua was perfect. It could deal devastating blows without always killing, giving them control over their captives. But the Aztecs weren't limited to close-range combat for distance. They relied on the atlel, an ingenious spear thrower that allowed them to hurl spears with great speed and accuracy. The atlel extended the warrior's reach, and allowed them to launch spears with much greater force than they could with their arms alone. A well-aimed throw could easily pierce armor or drop an enemy before they even got close. It was the perfect opening move in battle. Strike hard and fast from afar, then close in with the makua weedle. The Aztecs also had a variety of other weapons, each tailored for specific uses. Slings were common as they allowed warriors to rain down small stones on enemies from a safe distance. They might not have been as flashy as a whittle, but they were effective for softening up an enemy line. Bows and arrows were also used, though they were often reserved for hunting or for lower-ranking soldiers, as the Aztec warrior elite preferred more hand-to-hand combat for protection. Aztec warriors didn't wear heavy metal armor. Instead, they used itcha, a kind of armor made from tightly woven cotton that had been soaked in salt water and dried. It sounds simple, but itcha hupiel was surprisingly effective. It was light, allowing warriors to move quickly, and it could withstand most cuts and blows in the hands of an Aztec warrior. This cotton armor provided protection without sacrificing agility, which was crucial. In the quick, brutal skirmishes, they preferred their weapons, armor, and attire made them icons in their own society. The people of Tenochtitlan revered these warriors, seeing them as extensions of the gods. Warriors who proved themselves in battle could achieve great honor and respect, and their weapons became symbols of their bravery and dedication to their city and their gods. So why were the Aztecs so terrifying? Well, for starters, they were masters of dominance, from their heart-stopping rituals to their sprawling empire. By the time they reached their peace, their name alone inspired awe and dread throughout Mesoamerica. They had become a civilization that made fear itself a tool, a way of life. Even for neighboring cities and tribes, being conquered didn't simply mean defeat. It meant surrendering lives, resources, and dignity to fuel an empire that was as relentless as it was powerful. The Aztecs' fearsome reputation and their relentless need for captives was enough to make even the strongest men quiver. At the heart of their capital city, the Templo Mayor stood as a towering reminder of the Aztecs' commitment to the gods, and to sacrifice. Skull racks lined with the remains of past sacrifices sent a clear message to visitors. The Aztec devotion and their means of displaying it were on a level no one else dared reach. The city itself was a hub of wealth, power, and unmistakable pride, a center that drew traitor and diplomats from across the region, only to overwhelm them with the grandeur and intensity of its culture. The Aztecs were also masters of diplomacy, but it was a diplomacy backed by a blade. They often offered neighboring states a choice: join the empire as tributary allies, or face the full might of their army. Many chose tribute, understanding that resistance meant open war with all the horror that entailed. Tribute wasn't just about goods or resources. It was about a public show of sub-Saharan cities that paid tribute had to acknowledge the Aztec supremacy, reinforcing Tenochtitlan's dominance without the need for constant conflict. For those who resisted, the punishment was swift and brutal. The Aztecs didn't rely solely on their military might or strategic alliances, though they built up a culture of fear and respect within their own society that bled into how others saw them. Every Aztec child was raised to believe in the gods' absolute authority and their own role in serving those gods. They were taught that sacrifice was noble, that bravery in battle was rewarded in this life and the next, and that the empire was destined to rule. This deep-seated belief in their own divine mandate fueled the Aztecs' expansion and influenced how others viewed them, not just as a military force, but as a chosen people with the gods on their side. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they were shocked by the scale and organization of the Aztec Empire. Even the European conquistadors, who had seen powerful empires back home, were awed by Tenochtitlan. But it wasn't just the scale of the city or the military that struck them. It was the Aztec system of rule through fear and ritual. The Aztecs had created an empire that didn't just control people's lands and resources, it controlled their minds and spirits, binding them to Tenochtitlan through a combination of reverence, dread, and the ever-present fear of divine wrath. Ultimately, the Aztecs built a civilization that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They took their faith, their military might, their psychological tactics, and their mastery of diplomacy, and combined them into an empire that few dared to challenge. In the end, the Aztecs weren't feared just for what they did. They were feared for who they were. They embodied a relentless drive, a devotion to the gods, and a willingness to go further than any other civilization to secure their place in the world. And even after their empire fell, the legacy of their power, their rituals, and their indomitable spirit lingered, leaving a lasting mark on history.